Jonah, take it away.
Thank you so much, Nick, and Queer Disrupt and Shout, obviously. So, as Nick was saying, this workshop is going to kind of give you an introduction of the queer history of zines, kind of going beyond the history of zines that you get in mainstream media. That will be kind of a short presentation. Then we will I will kind of show you how to make your own zine and then break out into small groups, kind of rooms, and we from Queer Disrupt will kind of circulate and make zines together. So I'm looking forward to that bit. But before that, I would like to introduce you to the queer history of zines. I'm going to share my okay, Nick, can you see that? Cool, awesome.
Perfect, brilliant.
Perfect. Welcome. Around mid 2015, Jay-Z launched his first Yeezy lookbook, and shortly thereafter clarified on Twitter, Z-I-N-E pronounced zine. A lot of people pronounce it wrong. Thank you, Jay-Z. Around the same time, dozens of articles about the history of zines appeared in pop culture media like Dazed and Vice. But this history that most of these articles had was the over-rehearsed, oversimplified zine history that is kind of what most of us who know what zines are aware of, which goes sci-fi zines, 1940s, which relied on self-reproduced sections of a zine. So people would kind of make 40 copies of their wee section, and then the other contributors would make another 40 copies and all of that kind of stuff. Then they would kind of send it together to a compiler, and then the compiler would put them together and kind of like a grab bag zine, and they would send them away to all the contributors. That's kind of how it worked before the availability of public mass copiers like the Xerox. And we have the punk culture in the 60s and 70s. The punks gave the zine its most recognizable aesthetic of like rip and mix and cut and paste, mostly due to the advent of the Xerox, as well as discontented office workers. So the punks were kind of like office workers that were kind of skiving off and making the most of their kind of capitalist modes of production. And then the kind of third straightforward history of zines period is the Riot Girls of the 90s, reclaiming space from the very masculine dominated print culture of the punk zines for young women. And sometimes here, like in the 90s, some people kind of tack on queercore as kind of, oh yeah, BT dubs, queers were also involved in making zines. And if queerness is at all mentioned, it is usually because of queercore, which is a genre of punk that had its attendant kind of zine boom. Nonetheless, queers have been contributing to the history of zine from its very beginning, even before the concept, if not the model of the zine, comes into being. So firstly, what is a zine? That is not a simple answer. It's not an easy answer. There's no specific format or aesthetic or even medium that is intrinsic to the zine. There is no political leaning or musical affiliation or class group that the zine is exclusively connected to, although mostly they are kind of left-leaning, kind of connected to punk, rock, and connected to working class. But I've also seen kind of like Nazi zines and, you know, kind of very, very middle-class zines. And zine purists, you know, trying to kind of categorize zines, zine purists have argued about kind of finding a neat definition of the zine, afraid that the expansive definition would make zines eventually undefinable. So across kind of time and research about zines, people have argued that if it's not a self-published printed material, it's not a zine. If it's not like an A4 or an A3 folded over, it's not a zine. If it's created by any other media than a Xerox machine, it's not a zine. So pre-1970s, there's no such thing as zines. If it's documenting something else but radical thoughts, for example, Yeezy's lookbook, that's not a zine. Whether it's published online or kind of in print, if it's published online, it's not a zine. And I feel like that is a very kind of conflicting way of looking at a zine. It also reminds me of these type of arguments that I've heard before in, I wonder where. Oh yeah, if you're not same-sex attracted, you're not a queer. If you're not out, you're not a queer. If you don't experience dysphoria or medical transition, you're not a queer. If you haven't experienced violence or discrimination, you're not a queer. These are kind of the same questions of taxonomizing and defining something that is undefinable. So I would argue that as with queerness, I would like to preserve a general definition of the zine. So described in the largest and vaguest terms, zines are usually self-published publications created by an individual for their from a marginal community for their own community. Zines are most often, I'm sorry about the sirens. Zines are most often vehicles of knowledge that would not otherwise be able to circulate freely in controlled print, or this kind of knowledge is simply, there's no commercial appeal. It means that the history of zine is connected to the history of underground communities, of communities creating their own resources and sharing their own knowledge. Anarchists, squatters, prison abolitionists, biohackers are all represented in the history of zines, but in this talk specifically, I'll concentrate on the long history of queer kind of intervention in zines. After all, zines are the queerest bunch amongst the many types of printed material. And people from the audience might disagree with me that some of these are even zines, but don't make me tap the sign again. So for the sake of brevity, I will not look at proto-zines before the beginning of the 20th century. Yes, I know that there are things that I could point and say, look, that's a zine from 1348 or 1517 or 1776, but I want to cover most ground regarding the queer contributions to publications and proto-zines at the start of the last century, before the official birth of the zine. And because of the nature of collections and available research and, COVID-19 and not letting me go into women's library in Glasgow, I will kind of mostly stay in UK and USA. So at the beginning of the last century, up until around the 1930s, there's many examples of queer publications that were kind of mainstream. So looking only in Germany, we have Die Freundin and Garçon for women loving women. We have Eigene for men loving men, and Das dritte Geschlecht for the trans community. All of these magazines were free in free circulation. They weren't kind of prohibited. They had a running print of over 10,000 copies per issue, and were sold at newspaper stands and on streets. Could you please, everyone, mute yourselves? Thank you. I'm getting feedback. On the other hand, we have the suffragette movement in the UK, who has their own paper, Vote for Women, which I am showing here. That was commercially produced and kind of, it was quite public and it was quite, supported by most of the population. But then we also have suffragette kind of niche publications like Urania. Urania was first published in 1916 and it had a much smaller publication. It was only around 250 copies. And it was a self-published magazine. It was curated by a couple of lesbians, Eve Gore Booth and Esther Roper, and also by someone who we would call now a trans or non-binary person, who went both by the names of Thomas Batty and Irene Clyde. Urania advocated for gender-free society as a means of solving the problems that the suffragettes were campaigning against, like gender discrimination in voting, work rights, and pension. It is interesting to note that this small run self-published queer publication itself was printed in Mumbai rather than in UK, even though it was distributed in on the British shores. It gives us an insight into censorship and different motives for queer publication going underground. Urania had a relatively long run, totaling 82 issues in 24 years up until 1940. So you can see the difference between what was happening on the continent and what was happening in the UK. I'm going to kind of jump ahead to the 1940s and again kind of look at the underground nature of queer zines that is showcased by this example, America's Gayest Magazine, as it touts on its header, called Vice Versa, which was curated and distributed by the lesbian secretary going by Lisa Ben, which is kind of like an anagram of lesbian. Starting with 1947. The story goes that Lisa was told by her boss that her kind of knitting at her secretary desk wouldn't kind of show or give off the impression of a serious and very important office. So he kind of made her kind of just look busy, right? So Lisa used the spare time to hand type and carbon copy 10 copies of each of the 9 issues of Vice Versa. And this kind of use of the office supplies and rudimentary printing technologies to create underground publications is a running theme in zine making history. So Vice Versa is a lo-fi film fanzine, so it doesn't have images, it's kind of just text on a yellow piece of paper. And Ben's editorial itself speaks of her hopes for the future of queer zines, and you have there kind of a quote from her: "Perhaps Vice Versa might be the forerunner of better magazines dedicated to the third sex, that is queer people or kind of women loving women, in some future time might take their rightful place on the newsstands beside other publications to be available openly and without restriction." So these examples show us that even before the official start of history of zines with the sci-fi fan publications, queer people were already self-publishing media that can easily be recognized as zines. They were created by individuals. They were run in small runs, depending on hijacked modes of capitalist production. They were collating information from all over the place, and they were distributing in the community, and they were made by the community. So I would kind of 100% call Urania and Vice Versa zines before kind of the boom of punk culture zines. So the next crucial period in the zine history, the 1960s independent publications like International Times and Spare Rib in the UK, and 1970s, which signaled the advent of the punk zine, aided in part by the wide availability of office copiers, especially the Xerox, obscures the epistolary gay and trans community that formed around self-published magazines like Transvestia, as early as 1952 as an underground publication, Turnabout, Straight to Hell, and Azalea. All of these are, so Turnabout, Transvestia are trans zine, Straight to Hell is male-loving men zine, and Azalea was a kind of lesbians of color zine. Well, punks were sharing details of gigs and political protests, anarchist ways of living, like squatting, and even how to make bombs at home. These queer zines that looked just as haphazardly put together as the straight punk zines created guidelines for avoiding trouble with the law, DIY kits for the gender transition, and where to find compassionate vendors. So you can see there the kind of central image is from Turnabout from 1963, and it's kind of a how to face, like, what do you do when you're arrested as a transvestite, or like as a trans person who is kind of dressed as their own gender, and how to keep an arrest from becoming a disaster. So it's do's and don'ts of kind of keeping yourself safe. And we definitely see these kind of historical moments reappearing in do's and don'ts of avoiding ICE, for example, in the like a couple of years ago, right? So these queer community zines functioned as pen pal and hookup Rolodexes. There were repository for DIY community resources. There were cut and paste newsletters in Turnabout, and in all of the trans zines that I looked at. There's clippings of kind of drag balls, news of drag balls, but also kind of, you know, a trans woman was murdered by police and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of information kind of like jam-packed into these small kind of cut and paste publications. They're an invaluable insight into the life of queer communities from the 60s and 70s. That is kind of eschewed when you're talking about punk zines as the thing that was happening in the 60s and 70s. So we have, parallel with the punk culture, we have the queer zines or the queer magazines that were creating, were kind of connecting individuals as a community, right? So we're finally arriving to the acknowledged queer zine, queer history zines. People in histories of zines mentioned queercore and homocore. Zines that come out of queercore subgenre of punk, which have relatively long runs from the 80s to the 90s. JD, which is the top one, is a Canadian one, launched in '85, and Homocore is an American one launched in '88. These zines bring queerness into punk and also punk into queerness. The music associated with them was specifically created by and for queers, and kind of talk about desire for other men or desire for other women, or the desire to become a woman, right? And there's a more explicit queer political dimension that is brought both into the music associated with them, but also the queer zines. The beauty of all of these zines is that they provide a snapshot of the multiple cultural artifacts of queercore. It's just not just the music, it's also the fashion sense, what they were watching, how they were reading mainstream movies in a queer way, and how they were kind of starting to produce not necessarily mainstream films, but porn, and also what they were reading and what their politics were. The Queer Zine Archive Project is a treasure trove of these kinds of zines. I will share kind of resources later, and I would love if you just went wild on the Queer Zine Archive Project. It's absolutely amazing. So the next period in the history of zines is the 90s, with the popularization of Riot Girl punk, as well as Riot Girl zines. Mainstream history of zines often separate queer, queercore and queer zines and Riot Girl zines, but in reality, they were very, very much intersecting. Many Riot Girl groups were lesbians or queer, to name just two, Bikini Kill and Team Dresch. And due to the political and cultural situation at the time, it's the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, many of these women were actually involved in AIDS activism and care for communities of their brothers. The Riot Girl punk music and their zines are defiantly political, in addition to sharing culture news and DIY resources. The activism that the Riot Girls were doing was in tune with queer politics. It was all about gender equality, sexual freedom, access to reproductive health, and hormones, as well as safer sex resources. While this is true of most Riot Girl zines, some were release that explicitly oriented towards lesbians. There's a beautiful history project called the Rebel Dykes History Project, specifically identifying the multi-layered cultural production of punk music, political organizing, and zines such as Shocking Pink, which you have an excerpt of the Teenage Sexism is from Shocking Pink, to build a well-rounded history of this London group of rebel dykes. So zines are therefore just one layer in a larger cultural queer history. As I said before, the same people involved in anarchist and riot grrrl politics were also campaigning for queer rights, and the zine and self-publication model fed back into from these communities and have been used in spreading awareness of campaigns of the campaigns such as ACT UP, as well as Outrage. These campaigns were concerned with medical, legal, and cultural discrimination of queer people. Let us not forget that all of this is on the background of the UK legislation called Section 28, which prohibited the production and distribution of material that, I'm quoting, promotes homosexuality. So it was kind of a back and forth, like a really beautiful symbiotic collaboration between Riot Grrrl and punk aesthetics, and kind of creating community materials to make people aware that this is happening. There's you know, gay people exist. Gay people have are in dire need of medicine. Gay people are also you can't speak about them because of Section 28. Right, next. After the 90s, straightforward history of the zines kind of taper off. And a lot of times people are like, well, people are just not interested in zines anymore because of the advent of the internet and blogs. Nonetheless, they haven't disappeared. As an underground medium, you can't say that something has disappeared simply because you can't see it there. You're just out of mainstream interest, right? So zines with their underground ethos, as well as their culture, as the counterculture that they usually thrive in, that of the punk, anarchy, DIY communities, have been instrumental in South American as well as North American indigenous rights movements. And the Accomplices Not Allies zine presents solutions to the ally industrial complex from an intersectional indigenous perspective, but it's also being used by queer communities to talk about allyship and to talk about kind of abolishing allyship in a way. And queer, especially trans manifestos that eschew a hostile academic publishing model have been distributed as zines. And you have there Maya Bellwether's Fucking Trans Women, and also another one, an amazing one that comes to mind is Emi Koyama's Trans Feminist Manifesto. This is kind of, you know, coming up to 2020. And in 2020, 2019, 2020, 2021, we have kind of globally experienced the pandemic and the isolation that queer folk have experienced because of this. And I think that explains the boom of queer history, queer zines that I've noticed in the past maybe 2 years, because of their tactile qualities, as well as kind of an extension of their long history of coagulating epistolary queer communities, of connecting individual queer people that are isolated, but kind of sharing knowledge in a community way. So I feel like zines have made a reemergence in the quarantine, where the queer community has been unable to meet up and share resources in physical spaces, as well as kind of unable to be visible, right? We haven't had a Pride March in what feels like centuries. So why we're making zines today? Why do I want to get you interested in zines? I feel like zine making is a way of making tangible history of recording your day-to-day, recording the quotidian, recording the intimate, and also recording the private, making the private visible. Queer zine making itself has been reinvigorated by the lockdown, as I said, and I wanted to kind of show you two zines, recent zines from the past year that kind of talk about queer kind of individuals in isolation, but also kind of making you say, oh, I know that person, oh, I'm that person, and kind of recognizing community, right? So there's Queer Intimacy by Thomas Hutton, who is pushing against mainstream portrayals of queer people as kind of stereotypically, you know, the only way to show a queer couple, a queer person is in a couple, and the only way to show a queer person is like kissing their same-sex partner, right? Thomas Hutton is saying, no, queer relationships are so much more, so much larger than that. They're intimate and playful, and they're not just overtly sexual. This is me and my housemates being queer together. There's another one, Aladdin's Cave by Pete Hammond. This is a story of a queer couple kind of getting together a couple of months before the pandemic, the very first lockdown happened in the UK. And it kind of shows their story through the lens of, okay, we're kind of isolated and there's a big sickness around us and everything. And this is kind of a very, very intimate way of kind of making the very private kind of queer intimacy public, right? Sorry. This is kind of my really, really speedy tour of the queer history of zines. What I want to do now with all of you is I want to actually all of us make history. I want all of us to kind of participate in this history. Where is it? There. In this history, a long, long, long history, more than 100 years long history of queers making magazines and queers talking about our community, and queers also talking about like sharing resources as well. So I will kind of show you how to make a zine. If Nick, if you can pause the recording, because I think it's kind of onto the next kind of bit.